Caitlin Clark didn't disappear. She didn't vanish. She didn't suddenly lose her love for the game. But something did change, and it changed in a way that shook the foundation of women's basketball in silence. Because what happened behind closed doors wasn't just another coaching disagreement. It wasn't just a tough decision or a difference in philosophy. What unfolded was a power struggle. The kind that only happens when a system realizes it no longer controls the most important person in the room. And that's the part nobody wants to say out loud. This wasn't about minutes. This wasn't about chemistry. This wasn't even about basketball. This was about what happens when a 22-year-old player becomes bigger than the institution built to contain her. For years, women's basketball fought for relevance. It begged for cameras, begged for ratings, begged for a moment that could finally push the sport into the mainstream conversation. And then, almost overnight, that moment arrived. Caitlin Clark didn't just show up, she detonated expectations. Arenas that used to sit half-empty suddenly sold out in minutes. Television numbers that once looked impossible started rivaling major men's sporting events. Casual fans, people who had never watched a women's game before, suddenly knew one name, one face, one shot from the logo that felt inevitable the second it left her hands. And that kind of influence, that kind of attention, it changes everything. But instead of celebration, something else started brewing. Quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. A tension that never made it to a press conference. A discomfort that didn't show up in box scores. A feeling inside the program that the balance of power had shifted. And not everyone was ready to accept it. Because when the system is used to deciding who matters, and suddenly the audience decides instead, control becomes fragile. And that's when things get dangerous. What I'm about to walk you through isn't a single moment. It's a chain reaction. A buildup of decisions, silences, and behind-the-scenes friction that eventually led to one unavoidable reality. The relationship between Caitlin Clark and the people meant to represent the very best of American basketball was never the same again. And once you understand how it started, you'll see why this story was never going to end quietly. To understand why this situation exploded the way it did, you have to understand one uncomfortable truth about sports institutions. They love stars. Right up until the moment the star stops needing them. Caitlin Clark didn't rise slowly through the ranks. She didn't wait her turn. She didn't blend in and gradually earn attention. She arrived and immediately bent the entire sport around her gravity. From the moment she stepped into the national spotlight, the rules changed. Games weren't just games anymore. They were events. Networks didn't just schedule broadcasts. They promoted them. Media coverage didn't politely acknowledge her performances. It obsessed over them. And most importantly, fans didn't follow teams. They followed her. That distinction matters more than people realize. Because when fans follow a player instead of a program, loyalty shifts. The power shifts. And suddenly, the institution that once dictated narratives finds itself reacting instead of leading. For decades, women's basketball was built on hierarchy. Respect was earned over time. Roles were defined. Systems mattered more than individuals. Coaches held authority, and players fit into the structure or risked being pushed aside. That approach worked, until it didn't. Because Caitlin Clark represents a completely different era. An era where visibility creates leverage. Where attention turns into influence. Where a single player can elevate an entire league's value without ever asking permission. And that kind of transformation doesn't sit comfortably with everyone. Inside traditional basketball circles, there's an unspoken rule. No one player is bigger than the program. It's a phrase repeated so often it starts to feel sacred. But what happens when reality challenges that belief? What happens when ticket sales spike because of one name? What happens when ratings drop the moment that name isn't involved? What happens when sponsors, broadcasters, and casual fans all point to the same player as the reason they're paying attention? That's not hypothetical anymore. That's Caitlin Clark. And whether people want to admit it or not, her rise forced a reckoning. Because the system that once decided who deserved the spotlight was suddenly competing with a player who generated her own. This is where the tension truly began. Not with an argument, not with a confrontation, but with discomfort. Discomfort from people who spent their careers earning respect through structure, longevity, and control, now watching a young player rewrite the rules without asking for approval. Discomfort from leadership used to shaping stars, now dealing with one they couldn't mold. And that discomfort quietly turned into resistance. You could see it in the language. The careful phrasing, the repeated emphasis on experience, on paying dues, on fitting into the culture. On the surface, those are reasonable values. In isolation, they sound fair. Necessary, even. But when applied selectively, especially to the most productive, visible player in the sport, they start to feel like barriers instead of principles. And that's when fans started noticing something wasn't adding up. Because this wasn't just another talented rookie trying to find her place. This was the player who had already changed the economics of women's basketball. The one drawing millions of viewers. The one bringing in fans who had never cared before. Yet somehow, the conversation wasn't about how to maximize her impact. It was about how to contain it. That's the moment the relationship began to fracture. Not publicly, not officially, but internally, where decisions are made long before explanations are offered. And the scary part? Once a system decides it needs to remind someone of their place, it rarely ends well. Because the next step isn't development. It's a message. And that message would soon become impossible to ignore. The moment everything shifted didn't happen during a practice. It didn't happen in a locker room. It didn't even happen face-to-face. It happened on a list. A roster announcement that was supposed to be routine instantly became one of the most explosive moments women's basketball had seen in years. When the Olympic roster dropped and Caitlin Clark's name wasn't on it, the reaction wasn't confusion. It was disbelief. Not quiet disbelief. Not polite disagreement. Outrage. Because by every measurable standard that fans understand, production, impact, visibility, momentum, Caitlin Clark felt like an automatic inclusion. She wasn't just having a good year. She wasn't just popular. She was redefining what the sport looked like to the outside world. And yet, somehow, she was left out. Almost immediately, the explanations began rolling in. Words like experience, chemistry, fit, phrases that have been used for decades to justify tough calls. On paper, they sounded reasonable, responsible even. Olympic teams are about balance, about trust, about systems that have been built over time. But here's where the disconnect started to become impossible to ignore. This wasn't a fringe player. This wasn't a developmental prospect. This was the most talked-about athlete in women's basketball. Fans didn't just question the decision, they questioned the logic behind it. Analysts started pulling numbers. Former players started speaking carefully but pointedly. Media segments popped up asking the same uncomfortable question from different angles. How do you leave the face of the sport at home? And more importantly, why did it feel intentional? Because the Olympic omission didn't just feel like a basketball decision. It felt symbolic, like a line being drawn. To a lot of people watching, the message was unmistakable. Greatness alone isn't enough. Not if it disrupts the hierarchy. Not if it arrives too fast. Not if it threatens the balance of power inside a system that values control as much as winning. That's when the narrative began to harden. This wasn't about readiness anymore. It wasn't about development. It was about whether the system was willing to bend at all. For Caitlin Clark, the snub wasn't just a professional disappointment. It was a revelation. Because for the first time, the gap between her impact on the sport and her standing within its highest institution became impossible to ignore. And that gap spoke volumes. Think about the position it put her in. On one hand, she was being celebrated everywhere else. Sold-out arenas, record-breaking viewership, unprecedented media attention, corporate interest flooding in, fans lining up hours early just to watch warm-ups. On the other hand, the most prestigious basketball program in the country was effectively saying, "Not yet." That contradiction is where trust begins to erode. Because when an institution asks you to wait while the world is telling you that you're already carrying the sport forward, it forces a difficult question. Wait for what? The Olympic moment was supposed to be a celebration, a chance to showcase the future alongside the present. Instead, it became a fault line, one that split fans, exposed philosophical divides, and quietly changed how Caitlin Clark viewed her relationship with the people in charge. And here's the part most people missed. What made the decision so damaging wasn't just who was left off. It was what came next. There was no recalibration, no public acknowledgement of the backlash, no sense that the conversation had shifted at all. If anything, the response felt colder. The explanations stayed rigid. The tone didn't soften. The system didn't blink. And that's when something subtle but significant happened. The story stopped being about whether Caitlin Clark should have made the Olympic team, and started being about why the system seemed so determined to prove it didn't need her. That's a dangerous position for any organization to take, especially when the numbers tell a different story. Because fans weren't just upset, they were invested. Many of them had never followed Olympic women's basketball closely before. They were tuning in for one reason. And suddenly, that reason was gone. For the first time, the idea that Team USA might be culturally out of sync with the moment started gaining traction. Not less talented, not less capable, but disconnected from what the audience actually wanted. And that perception matters. Because once fans believe an institution is prioritizing internal politics over the growth of the game, every decision gets reinterpreted through that lens. Trust erodes faster. Skepticism grows louder. Inside the basketball world, the Olympic snub became more than a single choice. It became a reference point, a moment people kept coming back to whenever new information surfaced, whenever rumors started circulating, whenever something didn't quite add up. It was the beginning of a narrative that wouldn't let go. And for Caitlin Clark, it marked the first time she saw clearly where the boundaries were, how high the walls really stood, and how reluctant the system was to adjust, even when the entire sport was changing around it. Because once that Olympic door closed, it didn't just shut out a player. It exposed a philosophy. And what happened after that, what insiders would later describe, what fans would start piecing together, made it clear that this wasn't going to be resolved quietly. Not when power is involved. Not when pride is on the line. And definitely not when a superstar realizes she might be fighting something bigger than basketball. And the next chapter? That's where things stop being public and start getting uncomfortable. What came after the Olympic decision never appeared in an official statement. There was no press release, no microphone, no clean explanation anyone could quote. Instead, it lived in whispers. Because when stories don't add up publicly, they almost always start circulating privately. And inside basketball circles, the same quiet question kept coming up again and again. What actually happened when Caitlin Clark was finally back in the room? According to multiple accounts that began circulating among people close to the program, the tension didn't dissolve once the cameras were gone. If anything, it thickened. Practices that were supposed to feel like opportunities reportedly felt like tests. And not the kind designed to help someone succeed. The claims that emerged weren't about effort. No one questioned her preparation. No one suggested she wasn't working. In fact, the opposite kept coming up, that she arrived early, stayed late, and approached everything with the seriousness of someone who knew exactly how much was on the line. But the way she was used, that's where the allegations start to paint a very different picture. Insiders have described situations where Caitlin Clark was reportedly placed into roles that minimized what made her dangerous. Instead of being empowered to create, she was asked to defer. Instead of initiating offense, she was pushed off the ball. Instead of being given the freedom that defines her game, she was boxed into positions that felt deliberately restrictive. Not to develop her, not to experiment, but to send a message. Picture it for a moment. A player who built her reputation on vision, range, and control, standing on the perimeter, waiting. A player whose presence alone bends defenses, watching possessions unfold without her fingerprints on them. To people observing from the sidelines, it didn't look like integration. It looked like containment. And here's what made the situation even more unsettling. When questions were raised, reportedly respectfully, privately, without drama, the response wasn't clarification. It wasn't instruction. It wasn't feedback. What multiple accounts describe instead was something colder. Distance. Silence where guidance should have been. Dismissiveness where communication should have lived. And in environments like that, silence isn't neutral. Silence is a signal. It tells a player exactly where they stand without ever having to say it out loud. Now, to be clear, none of this was ever confirmed publicly. No one went on record. No player stepped up to risk their career by challenging leadership outright. That's not how these situations usually surface. They leak. Slowly. Carefully. Through people who notice patterns and compare notes. And what those patterns suggested was unsettling. Other players, according to people familiar with the environment, noticed it too. The glances. The hesitation. The subtle awareness that something felt off. That the most visible player in the sport was being handled differently. Not harsher, not louder, but quieter. And quiet treatment is often the most telling kind. Because when a superstar is ignored rather than challenged, it sends a message not just to them, but to everyone watching. Fall in line. This is where the narrative really started to shift. Because at this point, it wasn't about one roster decision anymore. It wasn't about one role or one drill. It was about control. Who gets to define the system? Who decides how greatness is expressed? Who holds authority when influence comes from outside the program? And all roads in this story lead back to one central figure, the architect of the philosophy, the keeper of the culture, the person with the final say. Because when situations like this don't resolve themselves, they almost always trace back to leadership. And in this case, the name attached to every difficult decision, every rigid explanation, every moment that seemed to prioritize structure over adaptation, was the same one fans had been discussing since the Olympic roster dropped. Cheryl Reeve. But to understand why this clash became inevitable, you have to understand who she is, and what she believes women's basketball should look like. Because once you do, everything that followed starts to make a disturbing kind of sense. To understand why this situation escalated instead of settling down, you have to understand Cheryl Reeve. Not as a villain, not as a caricature, but as a product of an era that shaped women's basketball long before Caitlin Clark ever picked up a ball. Because this wasn't a random conflict. It was a collision of philosophies. Cheryl Reeve didn't stumble into power. She earned it. Decades in the sport. Championships. Gold medals. Respect that was built the slow, grinding way, through structure, discipline, and absolute belief in the system she created. Her teams weren't built around flash. They were built around execution, around trust, around roles that were clearly defined and rarely questioned. And for most of her career, that philosophy worked. It produced winners. It produced consistency. It produced control. In Reeve's world, no player mattered more than the framework. Talent was welcomed, but only if it bent to the system. Stardom was tolerated, but never allowed to dictate terms. The message was clear and unwavering. The jersey comes first, always. That belief wasn't personal. It was foundational. But Caitlin Clark represents something that fundamentally disrupts that foundation. She isn't just a player you plug into a scheme. She is the scheme. Her game thrives on freedom, improvisation, and trust that the ball will find her when it matters most. You don't mute her and expect the same result. You don't constrain her and get the best version. And that's where the tension becomes unavoidable. From Reeve's perspective, Caitlin Clark isn't just a challenge, she's a risk. A player whose influence extends beyond the court. A player whose popularity brings outside pressure into rooms that have always been sealed off from public opinion. A player who, simply by existing, shifts attention away from the collective and onto herself. That kind of presence threatens order. And when order is the cornerstone of your legacy, threats don't get embraced, they get managed. This is where the language started to matter. Reeve's public comments, carefully worded and technically sound, emphasized the same themes over and over again. Chemistry, experience, fitting in, paying dues. All concepts that resonate deeply with coaches who came up in an era where opportunity was scarce and respect had to be clawed for. On the surface, it sounded fair. Principled, even. But beneath the surface, it revealed something else entirely. A refusal to adapt. Because Caitlin Clark doesn't fit neatly into that worldview. She didn't wait 10 years to earn influence. She didn't gradually build recognition. She arrived already carrying the sport on her back, already commanding attention that programs spent decades trying to generate. And that creates a problem for leaders who believe authority must always flow top-down. Think about it from Reeve's perspective. You've spent your life proving that no one is bigger than the team, and suddenly the world is telling you that one player might be bigger than the moment, bigger than the event, bigger than the institution itself. That's destabilizing. Not because it's false, but because it might be true. And instead of confronting that reality, instead of finding a way to integrate this new kind of power, the instinct becomes to reassert control, to remind everyone who's in charge, to prove that the system still dictates terms. That's where people believe things started going wrong. Because when leadership prioritizes preserving authority over maximizing potential, decisions stop being about winning in the long term and start being about maintaining order in the short term. And Caitlin Clark was never going to be a quiet participant in someone else's hierarchy. Not intentionally, not arrogantly, but simply by being who she is. She commands attention without asking for it. She draws eyes without demanding them. She changes outcomes without forcing the issue. That kind of impact doesn't fit inside rigid structures. It exposes them. This is why the conflict was never going to be resolved with a conversation, or a meeting, or a compromise, because compromise requires flexibility, and flexibility requires acknowledging that the old rules might not apply anymore. For someone like Reeve, whose career was built on those rules, that acknowledgement comes at a cost. It forces you to admit that the sport has evolved past the framework that once defined it. And that's not an easy thing to accept, especially when your legacy is tied to the old way working. So instead, the system tightened. Roles became rigid. Expectations narrowed. Silence replaced dialogue. And Caitlin Clark, whether she wanted to or not, became a symbol. Not just of change, but of everything the old guard feared losing. Control. Authority. Narrative power. By this point, the divide was no longer subtle. It was philosophical. And philosophical divides don't heal quietly. They widen. They harden. They force choices. And that's when Caitlin Clark made hers. Not loudly. Not publicly. But decisively. Because when a superstar realizes the system has no intention of meeting her halfway, there are only two options left. Fight the system, or step away from it entirely. And what happened next sent shockwaves through women's basketball, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. There's a moment in every power struggle when one side realizes the rules have changed. Not because anyone announced it, but because reality makes it undeniable. For Caitlin Clark, that moment didn't come with a speech. It didn't come with a tweet. It didn't come with a confrontation. It came with clarity. Because once you step back and look at the situation honestly, one truth becomes impossible to escape. Caitlin Clark didn't need Team USA to validate her greatness anymore. And that realization quietly flipped the entire balance of power on its head. For generations, the national team was the pinnacle, the ultimate stamp of approval. If you wore that jersey, you had arrived. It meant you were among the chosen few. It meant the system had embraced you. But Caitlin Clark represents a new era, one where the system benefits from the player more than the player benefits from the system. And that terrified people. Look at the numbers. Not the feelings. Not the opinions. The numbers. When Caitlin Clark plays, ratings spike. When she sits, interest drops. Her college games pulled in millions of viewers who had never watched women's basketball before. Her presence didn't just grow the audience. It changed who the audience was. These weren't diehards. These weren't longtime insiders. These were casual fans. New fans. The kind of fans every league spends decades trying to reach. And that matters more than championships. Because championships are remembered by historians. Audiences are remembered by executives. Sponsors don't chase tradition. They chase attention. Networks don't care about hierarchy. They care about eyeballs. And Caitlin Clark delivers both in quantities women's basketball had never seen. That's why the leverage shifted the moment she stopped chasing approval. Think about how radical that is. Most players would have done anything to get back in. They would have accepted a reduced role, stayed quiet, trusted the process, waited patiently for their turn. That's how the system is designed to work, reward compliance, punish disruption. But Caitlin Clark didn't lash out. She simply stopped centering her future around an institution that didn't seem interested in fully embracing her present. And that silence was louder than any protest. Because when a star doesn't beg, when she doesn't plead, when she doesn't campaign for inclusion, it sends a message far more powerful than words ever could. I don't need you. That's when everything changed. Behind the scenes, people started to notice. Media conversations shifted. Instead of asking, will Caitlin Clark make Team USA? The question became, can Team USA afford to move forward without her? That's a very different conversation. Because without her, something crucial disappears. Not talent, there's plenty of that. Not experience, the program is loaded with it. What disappears is cultural gravity. The magnetism. The casual fan who only tunes in because Caitlin Clark is playing doesn't stick around out of loyalty. They follow the star. And when the star isn't there, they drift. That's not speculation. It's how modern sports consumption works. And once that reality set in, the optics became brutal. Every Team USA highlight without Clark felt incomplete. Every marketing push felt slightly hollow. Every conversation about growth circled back to the same uncomfortable absence. Meanwhile, Caitlin Clark's career kept accelerating. She didn't slow down. She didn't fade. She didn't disappear. She kept showing up, kept working, kept building a brand and a legacy on her own terms. And the more she did, the clearer it became that the leverage no longer lived with the gatekeepers. It lived with the player. That's the moment when institutions usually pivot, when they soften their tone, when they find a way to rebuild bridges quietly and move forward. But that's not what happened here. Instead, silence lingered. No clear outreach, no public recalibration, no acknowledgement that the relationship had shifted. And that silence did more damage than any public argument ever could. Because in the absence of communication, narratives fill the void. Fans speculate, players whisper, media draws connections. And once those narratives take hold, they don't fade easily. At this point, the situation wasn't just about Caitlin Clark anymore. It was about what her treatment represented. To younger players watching closely, to future stars deciding how much power they're allowed to have, to a league standing on the edge of mainstream relevance. If the most influential player in the sport could be marginalized for challenging the hierarchy, even unintentionally, what message did that send? That's when the conversation escalated from controversy to consequence. Because this wasn't just a relationship strained. It was a warning sign, and the fallout was about to go public in ways no one could control. Not because Caitlin Clark spoke out, but because the silence around her became impossible to ignore. And that silence, it was about to expose cracks far deeper than anyone expected. Silence can hold power, but only for so long. At first, the lack of response felt calculated, strategic, as if the people in charge believed this moment would pass like so many others before it. That public attention would shift, that the noise would die down, that Caitlin Clark would eventually fall back into line, quietly re-enter the fold, and everything would return to normal. But this time it didn't. Because the silence didn't calm the situation, it aggravated it. In the absence of clarity, fans began filling in the gaps themselves. And once that happened, the narrative took on a life of its own. Not because anyone fabricated a story, but because people started connecting dots that had been sitting in plain sight for months. Why was the most visible player in the sport always framed as a future piece instead of a present necessity? Why did every explanation lean on the same buzzwords while avoiding the obvious impact she was having? Why did it feel like the system was more focused on proving a point than maximizing the moment? These weren't fringe questions anymore. They were being asked on national broadcasts, in packed comment sections, across social media timelines that no longer belonged just to basketball insiders. And once public perception shifts, control slips fast. Fans weren't just debating basketball decisions. They were questioning intent. They started framing the situation as resistance rather than evaluation, as ego rather than philosophy, as an institution protecting itself instead of nurturing the future. That's when the pressure began building from every direction at once. Former players spoke carefully, but the message was unmistakable. They talked about embracing greatness, about how rare moments like this are, about how the national team is supposed to showcase the very best of the sport, not restrain it. They didn't name names. They didn't accuse anyone outright. They didn't have to, because everyone knew exactly what they were referring to. Inside the league, conversations grew quieter but heavier. Players noticed how fans reacted. They noticed which jerseys sold out first. They noticed which games drew the biggest crowds. And they noticed how one name kept dominating every discussion, even when she wasn't present. That kind of attention creates unease. Because if Caitlin Clark could be sidelined, minimized, or kept at arm's length despite being the sport's biggest draw, what did that mean for everyone else? What did it say about how power really worked? These aren't questions players ask publicly. They ask them in private, in text threads, in locker rooms, in conversations that never make it into headlines, but still shape how people feel about leadership. And the longer the silence dragged on, the louder those conversations became. Meanwhile, Team USA's public image started to feel off. Not broken, not failing, just disconnected. Every promotional push felt like it was missing something. Every conversation about growth circled back to the same absence. Casual fans who had tuned in because of Caitlin Clark started tuning out just as quickly. That's the danger of building momentum around a star and then pretending the star doesn't matter. Momentum doesn't pause. It either accelerates or it evaporates. And while the program stayed quiet, the backlash grew teeth. Hashtags trended. Opinion pieces multiplied. Clips were replayed. Quotes were dissected. Every past comment that emphasized system over individual was reinterpreted through a harsher lens. Not as leadership, but as stubbornness. The optics became impossible to manage. Because from the outside, it didn't look like discipline. It looked like insecurity. It didn't look like philosophy. It looked like resistance to change. And that's when the most damaging thing happened. The narrative stopped being about whether Caitlin Clark deserved a role, and started being about whether leadership had mishandled the biggest opportunity women's basketball had ever been given. That's a much heavier accusation. Because missed opportunities don't just cost wins. They cost eras. Inside USA basketball circles, according to people familiar with the environment, discomfort began to spread. Not panic, not revolt, but concern. Quiet concern that this situation was spiraling beyond what anyone had intended. When controversy reaches that point, it stops being about right or wrong. It becomes about damage control. But damage control requires engagement. And engagement never came. No reframing. No bridge building. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the world had changed faster than the system expected. And so the backlash kept growing. The fans weren't backing down. The media wasn't moving on. And Caitlin Clark wasn't reacting at all. That last part is what made everything worse. Because when the person at the center of the storm refuses to participate, refuses to escalate, refuses to give the controversy oxygen, it forces everyone else to sit with the discomfort. Her silence wasn't passive. It was deliberate. And as the noise around her grew louder, her calm made one thing painfully clear. She had already moved on mentally. While institutions debated optics, she focused on preparation. While leadership weighed messaging, she stayed in the gym. While commentators speculated about reconciliation, she quietly built something separate, something independent. And that independence scared people. Because once a superstar proves she can thrive without the system loses its leverage forever. That's when the conversation shifted again, this time toward consequences. Not for Caitlin Clark, for the people who underestimated what she represented. And as pressure mounted from fans, media, former players, and even quiet corners of the league itself, one question started echoing louder than all the rest. What happens if this never gets fixed? Because at this point, the damage wasn't hypothetical. It was happening in real time. While the debate raged on television panels and social media timelines, Caitlin Clark did something that confused almost everyone watching. She disappeared, not from basketball, but from the noise. No cryptic posts. No vague quotes. No public frustration disguised as motivation. Just work. Inside training facilities, the reports started sounding the same no matter who you asked. Locked in. Focused. Relentless. A player who wasn't carrying controversy into the gym, she was leaving it at the door. And that choice said more than any statement ever could. Because this wasn't avoidance. It was separation. Caitlin Clark wasn't waiting for validation anymore. She wasn't lingering around the edges of a system that seemed unsure how to handle her presence. She was building something parallel, a career, a legacy, a future that didn't depend on anyone's approval except her own. Her routines intensified. Extra shooting sessions that stretched long after scheduled practices ended. Film study that went deeper than necessity. Conditioning that pushed past comfort. People around her noticed a shift, not in attitude, but in intent. This wasn't preparation for a season. This was preparation for a statement. And that statement didn't need words. Because every rep reinforced the same truth. She wasn't shrinking under pressure, she was sharpening herself inside it. The irony is that while leadership circles debated philosophy and optics, Caitlin Clark was quietly proving the very thing the system feared most. That she could thrive independently. That she didn't need ceremonial inclusion to justify her place at the top of the sport. Every update about her progress reignited the conversation. Every clip reminded fans what was missing. And every game she prepared for carried a different kind of weight. Not just competition, but context. Opponents felt it. Fans felt it. The league felt it. Because when a star steps away from institutional conflict and doubles down on performance, the narrative flips. The focus moves away from politics and back onto excellence. And excellence has a way of exposing mistakes without ever calling them out. This is where the situation became irreversible. Because now, reconciliation wasn't just about extending an invitation. It would require an acknowledgement. Not that Caitlin Clark needed the system, but that the system needed her. And acknowledgements like that don't come easily. As her presence in the league grew more dominant, the contrast became impossible to ignore. One side stuck in deliberation. the other moving forward with clarity. The question was no longer whether Caitlin Clark would be fine without Team USA. She already was. The real question was whether Team USA could afford to keep pretending this was just another situation that would resolve itself over time. Because time wasn't neutral anymore. Every game without her in the national narrative widened the gap. Every new fan she brought in without the program's involvement shifted loyalty. And every success she achieved independently made the eventual reckoning harder to avoid. At some point, institutions have to decide whether they're protecting tradition or suffocating opportunity. And as Caitlin Clark continued to rise, one thing became increasingly clear to everyone paying attention. The future of women's basketball was moving forward. The only question left was who would move with it, and who would be left behind. By this point, pretending everything was fine became impossible. What started as a roster debate had turned into a full-blown reckoning. Not just for one coach, not just for one program, but for the entire structure surrounding women's basketball at its most powerful level. Because fallout doesn't always arrive with explosions. Sometimes it arrives as doubt. Quiet questions began circulating in places fans never see. Boardrooms, executive meetings, closed-door conversations where people speak more freely because there are no cameras, no headlines, no immediate consequences. And the questions all sounded uncomfortably similar. Did we misread the moment? Did we underestimate how much this player matters? Did we protect the system at the cost of the sport? Those questions don't come up unless something has already gone wrong. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting, not from one direction, but from all sides at once. Media scrutiny hadn't slowed. Former players continued speaking in coded language that everyone understood. Fans weren't letting the issue die. And sponsors, quietly but decisively, were paying attention to what actually moved the needle. Because sponsors don't care about internal politics. They care about reach. They care about relevance. And Caitlin Clark had become the single biggest bridge between women's basketball and the mainstream audience it had chased for decades. That's why the long-term implications started to feel heavier than any short-term controversy. This wasn't just about one Olympic cycle. This was about momentum, something the sport finally had, and something it could lose far faster than it gained. Inside leadership circles, according to people familiar with the situation, the tone began to shift. Not publicly, not in a way anyone could quote, but privately, concern replaced confidence. Because even if Team USA continued to win, something essential had changed. Victories didn't feel as complete. The absence was always there, unspoken, but visible. Every international competition raised the same question. Every broadcast comparison highlighted the same gap. Every fan discussion circled back to the same name. And then came the legacy issue. Because whether people wanted to admit it or not, this situation became tied to Cheryl Reeve's name in ways no championship could fully erase. Not because she failed as a coach, her resume speaks for itself, but because history doesn't just remember wins. It remembers moments. And this moment wasn't about strategy or execution. It was about whether leadership recognized the turning point when it arrived, or tried to hold on to control while the ground shifted beneath them. For coaches, legacy is fragile. It's built over decades and reframed in a single chapter. And rightly or wrongly, Caitlin Clark became that chapter. Not because she demanded anything, not because she challenged authority publicly, but because her presence forced a choice, adapt or resist. And resistance has consequences. As whispers grew louder and discomfort spread, one reality settled in. Even if this situation never exploded publicly, the damage was already done internally. Trust had been strained. Perceptions had hardened. Lines had been drawn. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to return to neutral. The program could move forward. It could continue operating. It could even succeed. But it would do so under a shadow shaped like a missed opportunity. Because no matter what came next, there would always be a comparison. A what if? A lingering sense that the sport's most powerful institution failed to fully embrace the moment that could have changed everything. And that's the kind of fallout that doesn't fade with time. It deepens. And as the sport stood at this crossroads, caught between tradition and transformation, one final question remained unanswered. Was it already too late? This is the part of the story where everything converges. Not in a dramatic press conference. Not with a public apology. Not with a sudden reconciliation that makes headlines. But with a choice. Because every movement reaches a moment where it has to decide what it values more: control or growth, tradition or transformation, comfort or courage. And women's basketball is standing in that exact moment right now. On one side is the institution, structured, proven, decorated with championships and medals earned over decades of discipline and hierarchy. A system that believes deeply in how it was built, because how it was built worked. On the other side is Caitlin Clark, not asking for permission, not demanding special treatment, simply existing as proof that the game has changed faster than the structures surrounding it. She didn't create this conflict. She didn't seek it out. She didn't weaponize her influence. She just became undeniable. And that's what made this situation so volatile. Because when a player becomes bigger than the pathway designed to contain her, the system has only two options: evolve or resist. And resistance always comes at a cost. What's been lost here isn't just a roster spot or a temporary relationship. It's trust. The kind of trust that tells future stars, if you elevate the sport will elevate you back. Right now, that message feels fractured. Young players watching this unfold are learning something, whether leadership intends it or not. They're learning that even if you do everything right, even if you carry the game into the mainstream, there may still be invisible limits placed on how much influence you're allowed to have. That's not a lesson that inspires loyalty. It's a lesson that encourages independence. And Caitlin Clark has already shown what independence looks like in this new era. It looks like building your own gravity. It looks like fans following you, not a logo. It looks like relevance that doesn't depend on institutional approval. That's the future, whether anyone likes it or not. The uncomfortable truth is this: women's basketball finally has what it's always fought for: attention, investment, cultural relevance. And this moment will determine whether it grows into something sustainable or fractures under internal resistance. Because greatness doesn't wait. It doesn't slow down to accommodate tradition. It doesn't ask if the system is ready. It arrives when it arrives. Caitlin Clark arrived. And instead of fully embracing her as a symbol of progress, the system hesitated. It questioned. It resisted. And in doing so, it may have missed the clearest opportunity it ever had to unify the sport around a single, undeniable force. That doesn't mean the story is over, but it does mean it's been changed forever. Because from this point on, every decision will be measured against this moment. Every future superstar will remember how the last one was treated. Every conversation about growth will carry this shadow in the background. And history will ask a simple question: did women's basketball rise to meet its moment, or did it protect its past at the cost of its future? Caitlin Clark has already made her choice. She chose to bet on herself, to focus on her craft, to let her game speak where politics stayed silent. And judging by everything we've seen so far, her voice is only getting louder. The rest of the sport now has a decision to make. Because some moments don't come back, and some mistakes don't fade. They just become lessons. If you think this story ends here, you're missing what's coming next. Because the next chapter of Caitlin Clark's career, and women's basketball as a whole, is going to expose even more cracks in the system. So if you want the real stories, the behind-the-scenes power moves, and the moments everyone else is afraid to talk about, hit subscribe right now. You don't want to be late to what happens next.